What is going on, chess YouTube? In today's video, we're looking at a very exciting gameplay between Jan-Krzysztof Duda, the Polish Grandmaster, and Magnus Carlsen, the Norwegian Grandmaster, and the best player, arguably, of all time. This game just happened in the weekly Title Tuesday tournament, and in the game, Magnus Carlsen goes straight for the dreaded Semi-Slav defense after knight c3 and then c6. Now, the Semi-Slav is one of Black's best and, most reliable defenses against 1d4. It is very sharp, especially if Black takes on c4 early in the game. So we'll have to wait and see what both players do go for. Now here, the two main lines for White, if you want to fight for an opening advantage, are bishop g5, getting the bishop outside the pawn chain, and the move e3, defending c4 immediately with the bishop on f1. Now there are other ideas, for example, g3 is playable and so on, but really, bishop g5 and e3 are the absolute main lines here. All right, in the game, Jan-Krzysztof Duda, bishop g5 is the move, the most ambitious choice. Of course, you are pinning that knight on f6 to the queen on d8, and beyond that, you are intending to go e3 with that dark squared bishop outside the pawn chain. That is the most, ambitious setup for White possible here. Now, Black has the option of taking on c4 immediately or after h6, bishop h4, and only then d takes c4. Those are the sharpest lines for Black available here, both the Botvinnik variation and the anti-Moscow gambit. Now, instead, in the game, knight b d7 was chosen by Magnus, and this is known as the Cambridge Springs opening. The idea being you are defending that knight on f6 with the knight on d7. If White takes, you take back, and you got a great game. Beyond that, Black has two main ideas. One, you can go simply bishop b7 and short castles in the spirit of the Queen's Gambit declined. You can also go queen to a5. That is the Cambridge Springs variation, intending a fast knight to e4, putting as much pressure as possible on that knight on c3. Maybe even bishop b4 would be coming in that scenario. Now here, Jan-Krzysztof Duda, e3 is the move of, again, defending c4 with the light squared bishop. Now Black goes h6. White goes bishop h4. So far, very standard stuff. And will Black go queen to a5? Turns out, no, he will not. In this game, Magnus goes bishop e7. And this is arguably the main line for Black here these days in the Semi-Slav. Black gets his bishop d7, his knight on d7. Overall, Black's setup is very, very solid. And he can take on c4 later in the game, especially after White goes, say, bishop d3, and then take on c4. All right, from here, bishop d3 was played, and this is Magnus Carlsen's trigger to take on c4. D takes c4 chosen, attacking the bishop with a gain of tempo. Of course, White just wasted one move, bringing the bishop to d3, and now after d takes c4, he wastes another tempo, recapturing on c4. That is the idea behind waiting for bishop d3 before taking on c4 with the d-pawn. All right, d takes, bishop takes. Now Magnus goes b5, a very typical move in the Semi-Slav opening, driving back that bishop. White goes bishop d3, and now bishop b7 from Black, making good use of that vacated b7 square, bringing the light squared bishop to that square. Now, of course, in most of these Queen's Gambit declined openings, this light squared bishop is going to be Black's main problem piece. If he can find a good way to activate it, say a6 and c5, then Black is going to have an outstanding game with virtually zero weaknesses. All right, here, White's got a lot of different options. You can go, for example, a3, prophylaxis against b4 advances from Black. You can also go queen c2, rook c1, or short castles. All of these moves are playable. It's really a matter of just picking one. All right, in the game, a3 was chosen by Duda. Then we had the move a5 for Magnus Carlsen, swinging his pawn down the board, maybe even threatening some sort of b4 advance, or this could be prophylaxis against a b4 advance from White, at which point Black could take twice with the a pawn and then the bishop, winning that pawn. So an interesting choice by Magnus. Now, the drawback of this move a5 instead of a6 is the pawn on b5 is a little bit looser. If Black ever goes c5 later in the game, then he may want to have that pawn on a6 instead of a5, where it does defend b5. So Magnus here may be intending something else other than a fast c5, as again, that pawn on b5 would be way, way too loose with both the bishop and the knight attacking it. All right, now both sides do castle. We have short castles and then short castles, and now here, Jan-Krzysztof Duda, the main moves for him as White include queen c2, rook c1, or maybe queen to e2. All these moves are playable. They're all very, very standard in this position for White. But instead of those here, Duda, he plays a very aggressive move, knight to e5, jumping in with the knight, maybe the first real mistake of this game. And as you can see by the eval bar on the left, kind of collapsing right now. This move right here is it's really throwing away all of white's advantage, and Magnus here, if he responds correctly, he may even be a little bit better as black on move 13 in the opening. All right, here, Magnus, he takes on e5. Knight takes e5 is the move. By far the best move here for black. White takes back, and then we have knight d7. Now here, we have a total transformation of the pawn structure. We have to talk about this with the pawn on e5 instead of on d4. Now, of course, white has a 5 versus 4 pawn majority on the king side. He's got 5 pawns on this side of the board versus the 4 of black. Meanwhile, black has the 3 versus 2 majority on the queen side. That means white will be attacking on the king side somehow and black on the queen side. Beyond that, this pawn on e5, that may be the most important pawn in this entire position. If that pawn falls, white's entire game will collapse. But if it stays there and stays strong, that could be the spearhead to launch the attack against the black king. All right, here, of course, the bishop on h4 is under attack. White takes on e7, bishop takes e7, black takes back, and then white goes f4, gaining space on the king side and bolstering his pawn on e5. And now we have this sort of unusual pawn structure on the dark squares for white. Again, if white can support that pawn on e5, maybe even go f5, or maybe go, say, bishop c2, queen d3, attack on this diagonal. If he can get some sort of attack going on the king side, he may indeed have decent chances here. All right, Magnus in the game. Knight c5 is the move, jumping down with the knight and pressuring the bishop. Now, it's a good time for a little mini puzzle here. Where should this bishop go? Should you move it at all? Do you keep it there? Do you go back to c2, back to e2, maybe somewhere else? If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the best square for the bishop, or at least the square white shows in the game. And I quite like this move. And if you're a beginner, it might seem a little counterintuitive. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this one. All right, here, white, he actually goes bishop b1. He doesn't go to c2 or e2. He goes back 2 squares to b1, blocking in his own rook on a1. And this move is actually very, very strong here. The idea being white wants to go queen c2, getting that famous queen and bishop battery on this diagonal here, threatening queen h7 checkmate. That is the idea. You know, in a lot of these queen's gambit structures, this battery of the queen and the bishop on this diagonal is the main attacking idea, which may force out weaknesses from black. For example, in response to queen c2, black may have to go f5 or g6, blocking the attack, but that would create other weaknesses on the king side as well. All right, here, Magnus, he ignores the idea and goes b4, gaining space on the queen side, completing the idea of a5 we saw earlier, finally pushing the b pawn 1 more square. And here, Duda, he shows the, you know, the, what's the word for this? The multiplicity of this move bishop b1. He doesn't even move the knight. He doesn't take on b4. Instead, queen to c2 is played immediately, threatening checkmate in one move on h7. The audacity of the Polish grandmaster in this position. Of course, if you take the knight, that is going to be lights out because queen h7 checkmates the black king on the spot. Therefore, you cannot do that. All right, here instead, g6 was chosen, again weakening the king side but blocking this diagonal for now. So the queen and the bishop have done their job. They forced out a weakness. Now, of course, the dark squares, including h6 and f6, are much weaker, and this is going to be very important for white's attacking chances on the king side. Now, of course, you got to do something about that knight on c3. It is under attack. White takes, black takes back, then we have rook takes a8, rook takes a8, and then the move knight to e2, dropping back with the knight, and I do apologize for that slight lag right there. All right, now here, Magnus, bishop a6 is the move, putting pressure on the knight and the rook on this diagonal, a very good move, especially in blitz. And look at this, both sides, I mean, they've got, you know, more than 2 minutes left on the clock. They started with 3 minutes. These guys not even wasting a minute in the first 21 moves of this game. Really remarkable stuff. All right, rook d1 is the move, sliding over the rook, getting out of the pin. That way now the knight can move to, say, d4 or somewhere else, depending on how the game goes. Now here, Magnus, b3 is the move, pushing the pawn 1 square forward, pressuring the queen. We have queen d2. The queen did its job on this diagonal, pressuring h7, forcing g6. So now it goes back to a different diagonal, different square. Now we have bishop takes e2, queen takes e2, and now, very importantly, white actually has the better minor piece in this position. Now, in these positions with pawns on both sides of the board, bishops tend to be a little bit better than knights, but of course, white's attack on the king side isn't really going anywhere yet, and black does have decent chances of making a pass pawn on the queen side here with his 2 versus 1 pawn majority on this side of the board. Now black goes rook d8, sliding over the rook. Then we have rook c1, pressuring the knight on the c5 square. Then we have rook d5, jumping up with the rook, down with the rook, whatever you want to call it, defending the knight on c5 with 2 pieces, both the rook and the queen. Now we have h3, then king g7, both sides making some little waiting moves. King to h2, queen d8, centralizing the queen on the d file, pressuring both the rook and the queen. And then we have queen c4, flying up with the queen. Of course, queen takes c4 is not being threatened yet, as that would lose the queen on the spot to queen takes, rook takes. That would not be a good idea at all. But here, Magnus, knight d3, jumping down with the knight and showing one of the ideas of queen to d8. With the queen and the rook supporting d3, the knight can jump in, put pressure on the rook, put pressure on the pawn on b2, and what is white going to do right here? It's not easy to find a good move. Here in this position, Duda, he makes a critical mistake in this game. Maybe not fatal, but certainly a critical mistake that gives Magnus a huge initiative and a very, very lasting advantage. He plays the move rook to c3. Now, what is the idea behind this move? First of all, knight takes c1 is being threatened, but you're also threatening the pawn on b2, and there's no way to defend the rook and defend the pawn. If you move the rook anywhere, then b2 will fall, and you can't go to c2, as then obviously the pawn takes the rook and you lose the game on the spot. So instead, rook c3 chosen in the game, but this move is very, very weak. Instead of that, the computer wants you to go rook to f1. The point being, the rook is better placed on the f file than it is on the c file. From here, white has various ideas, including potentially f5 at some point, trying to bust open the king side at all costs. Now, instead of that, again, rook c3 chosen in the game, and now Magnus, he shows the key idea to exploit this very weak move. He goes knight to f2, dropping down with the knight. Now black is threatening all kinds of ideas, including rook d1 and then rook h1, hitting the king, maybe even flying out with the queen to the h4 square. So we can see, with the rook coming here, d1 then h1, the queen coming out to h4, white's king is suddenly under a tremendous amount of pressure, and the hunter has become the hunted. Black now is the one attacking the white king. All right, here, Duda, he makes another critical mistake. Bishop to e4. His idea, I'm trying to pressure the rook, and if you take my bishop, I take your very important knight, and right now, this knight is indeed better placed than the bishop, so a decent idea in theory, but here, Magnus, he has the option of just ignoring this possibility and simply going rook d1, again threatening ideas like queen h4, rook to h1, and that would be checkmate. Now, fortunately for Duda, in this game, instead of that, Magnus goes knight g4. Now, this move is very, very tricky, especially in blitz. It is so easy to mess this up as white. Now, if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the best continuation for white in this position. It is not an obvious move at all. That is your one hint. And if you're enjoying this video, again, smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this. All right, here. The most obvious move in chess, you always got to consider threats, captures, and checks. And here, one possible capture is h takes g4. But this move would be a massive mistake in return, because here, black goes queen to h4, flying out with the queen, hitting the king, forcing king g1, then rook d1, forces queen to f1, and you win the queen. So overall, taking on g4 would lead to the loss of your queen for the rook and the knight, and black would be simply winning. Now, fortunately, Duda, he doesn't take on g4. This guy is rated 3198 ELO on chess.com for a reason. Instead of that, king g3 was chosen, marching up with the king, pressuring the knight with the king, and very importantly, the king is now a fighting piece or an active defending piece, guarding the h4 square, stopping queen h4 ideas. That is the key idea here. All right, Magnus, he knows his knight is a goner. He takes on e5. Knight takes e5 is the move. What is the idea of this? If you take the knight with the f-pawn, then queen g5 is the move. Continuing to fly out with the queen, continuing to pile up threats against the white king. And yes, white will be a little better, but still, you know, this is not a position you want to defend in a blitz game against the goat. So with that in mind, instead, queen takes b3 chosen in the game. The knight was targeting the queen. Instead, the queen drops back one square to b3. And now here, the best move for Duda is to continue harassing the queen with the move rook b5. Instead, in the game, rook d2 shows and dropping down with the rook. But this move is significantly weaker. And here, Duda is going to have a bunch of easy ways to simplify. The easiest one being simply rook c2, dropping back with the rook and offering the rook trade. Instead of that, though, rook c5 chosen in the game. Duda messing up a little bit in time pressure. Very understandable. Both sides have 15 to 22 seconds left on the clock. This is no joke. All right, Magnus, knight d7, retreating the knight. Of course, his knight on e5 was under attack by the pawn. You must retreat it. Now, queen c3 targets the king on the g7 square. Now we have knight f6, blocking the attack. Rook takes c6, gobbling up that free pawn. And now here, of course, that bishop on e4 is not under attack yet, as again, the knight on f6 is pinned to the king. And here, Duda is simply up a pawn in this complicated middle game, and his bishop on e4 is becoming more and more active. Dare I say, this bishop with the one pawn on b2 on the queen side, this bishop is likely better than the knight in this position, meaning Duda is up a pawn, up the better minor piece. You know, his pawn structure is a little bit weak, and his king is a little bit weak. But overall, Duda having a significant advantage here. All right, rook d1 chosen in the game, dropping down with the rook. Then we have bishop f3 retreating and targeting the rook on d1. Then we have rook d3 retreating, queen to e5, marching up with the queen. Rook b3 putting pressure on the pawn on b2. Both sides making very logical moves, trying to hang in there in extreme time pressure. Both sides down to 7 seconds on the clock. All right, rook c7 chosen in the game, piling up pressure on the 7th rank. I feel like I'm going to sneeze. Oh, that's the worst feeling when you think you're going to sneeze, but you can't quite sneeze yet. It is the worst feeling. All right, king to f8. That's what I get for doing these games in one take for you guys. Now, queen c5, sliding over with the queen, pressuring the king on f8. The king goes to g7, marching back down. We have queen e5, again, pinning that knight to the king. Again, king f8. Again, queen c5. Again, king g7. And here, if Duda wants a draw, he just goes queen e5. And that is a 3 full draw by repetition on the spot. Queen e5 would be a draw, as that is the 3rd time this exact position has been achieved. But instead of that, here, Duda, he shows he's playing for a win against the goat. He wants blood. He goes rook c8, pushing the rook back to the back rank and pressuring the queen on d8. Now, where is that queen going to go? Well, you can't ignore the threat and simply drop back with your rook. Say, rook b5 here is possible. Not only possible, that might be the best move for black. The point being, after rook b5, if you take that rook, the rook on c8 is undefended. Now, again, you are still down a pawn in the endgame, but that is likely the best way to defend as black. Now, instead, Magnus, he doesn't do that. He finds a different way to counterattack. He goes knight to d7, pressuring the queen on c5 with the knight. Now here, white, he gets out of the attack. Queen to d4 check. Look at this. The queen attacking the king. The rook attacking the queen. Therefore, black's got to do something. Maybe queen f6, offering the queen trade, defending with the queen, and getting it out of the attack of the rook. But instead, e5 chosen in the game. A much more complicated variation. Now, of course, if you take on d8, black takes on d4, and the game continues, and that is what happened here. So, rook takes d8, e takes d4 is the move. Now we have rook takes d7, d takes e3, and here Duda, he finds the most diabolical, sacrificial idea to win the game on the spot. This one is unbelievable. Again, if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and find this one right here for Duda. This is a shocker. Rook takes f7, giving up the rook for the pawn. And here's the idea. If you take the rook, king takes f7, then bishop to e4. Hits the rook and the king on the spot. And white is simply winning. He's going to be up an entire piece in the endgame. And the pawn on e3, of course, is going to be stopped by the white king. If you go e2 and the king drops back, king f2, you stop the pawn and you win the game. And for that reason, immediately after rook takes f7, way back here, Magnus Carlsen, he resigns on the spot to the Polish Grandmaster, Jan-Krzysztof Duda. Wow, what a blitz game between Jan-Krzysztof Duda and the GOAT Magnus Carlsen. I bet you did not expect Jan-Krzysztof to win this game, but sure enough, he did. It was a very well-deserved victory. I mean, he really pulled this one out of his hat. Very impressive stuff. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, smash that like button and comment down below what you thought of this game. It was a, real treat doing this one. And, until next time, I'll see you in the next video.